Let me start with a confession. I didn't just like the first The Old Guard, I inhaled it. During the suffocation of lockdown, when the world outside felt like it was collapsing, this movie became my lifeline. It wasn't perfect, far from it. The action was occasionally clunky, the pacing uneven, and the CGI, well, let's just say Netflix's budget didn't stretch to Avengers level spectacle. But none of that mattered, because The Old Guard wasn't just another action flick, it was a story about people. People who had lived for centuries, yes, but who were still achingly, devastatingly human. It was about Andy's exhaustion, Nile's awakening, Booker's grief, Joe and Nicky's unshakable love. It was about found family in a way that felt raw and real, not just a hollow Hollywood trope. So when The Old Guard 2 was announced, I was ecstatic. Finally a chance to return to these characters to see where their journey would take them next. And then I watched it. And boy, what a mess it was. And not the kind of mess you can laugh off, not the charming, rough around the edges mess that endears you more than anything. No, this was a production disaster, a narrative train wreck, a betrayal of everything that made the original work. But here's the thing, I will still rewatch it. I'll still give it 5 stars on Letterboxd for all I care, because I'm that far gone. Because Charlize Theron with an axe is still Charlize Theron with an axe. But that doesn't mean that I'm not furious about what we got. So let's break it down. While The Old Guard 2 failed, where it went wrong, and how it could have and should have been so much better. Before we even get into the film itself, we need to talk about the absolute nightmare that was its production. Because when a movie is this disjointed, this tonally inconsistent, this obviously stitched together from conflicting visions, the problem usually starts behind the scenes. Netflix, usually trigger happy with green lights when the movie is successful, took an unusually long time to commit to The Old Guard 2. The first film dropped in July 2020 and the sequel wasn't officially announced until January 2021, 6 whole months later. For a streaming giant that routinely announces sequels within weeks of the film's release, this was suspicious. And then things got worse. In August of 2021, Netflix dropped a bombshell. Gina Prince Bythewood, the director who had shaped the first film's emotional core, would not be returning. Prince Bythewood wasn't just some hired gun. She was the reason The Old Guard worked as more than just a generic action flick. She fought for Nile's centrality, for Joe and Nicky's romance, along with the writer Greg Rucka. Character-driven moments were her doing, and her replacement was Victoria Mahoney, whose directing credits were mostly in TV, with a stint as a second unit director on The Rise of Skywalker. The change wasn't bad in itself, but in hindsight, it signified that something was going on behind the scenes. Principal photography began in June 2022, and almost immediately things went off the rails. In August of the same year, the film's set caught fire while being dismantled, which also delayed production. In September of 2022, additional filming in the UK wrapped finally. However, Charlize Theron later revealed that Netflix halted post-production 5 weeks in due to a regime change at the company. Apparently, The Old Guard 2 being the only production that was affected by it. And then came the test screenings. Word got out that early audiences were not impressed. The response was so lukewarm that Netflix ordered 2 additional weeks of reshoots in October of 2024, a desperate attempt to salvage whatever they could. The result, a film that feels Frankenstein together, with jarring tonal shifts, half-baked character arcs, and a third act that isn't an ending, just a trailer for a sequel we'll probably never get.
From the last immortal has the power to take away anyone else's immortality.
The brilliance of The Old Guard lay in its restraint. It understood that immortality worked best as a premise, not as the plot itself. The first film wasn't about why Andy and her team couldn't die. It was about what they did with that endless time. Their immortality was a vehicle for exploring grief, purpose, and the weight of centuries, not a puzzle to be solved. The mystery was part of the point. The vagueness gave their lives meaning. But The Old Guard 2 fumbles this completely. Instead of deepening the characters or their relationships, the sequel becomes obsessed with explaining the very thing that should have remained unexplained. Suddenly, we're bombarded with clunky mythology, legends about immortals, despite the fact that they've supposedly been hiding for millennia. Then we get a special birthmark that marks Nile as the last immortal, and a convoluted system of immortality transfer that raises more questions than it answers. The problems with this approach are glaring. First, the legends make no sense. If immortals have spent centuries erasing their existence, who was documenting these stories? Why do they suddenly align perfectly with the events of the movie? But that's the movie logic, I will let it slide. And why, if these myths were common enough for Tuah to uncover them, did no one, not even Copley, who dedicated his life to researching the team, why no one ever mentioned them in the first film? Second, the rules are inconsistent. In the first film, when Nile stabs Andy, Andy still heals. Her immortality disappears later. But in The Old Guard 2, Nile stabs Booker and his immortality vanishes instantly. And there's no explanation for this discrepancy. The first film was smart enough to leave these questions unanswered because they didn't matter. The sequel, in its desperation to build a franchise or I don't know what, turns what was once elegant ambiguity into a tangled mess of half-baked lore. The movie didn't need two new immortals crammed into an already crowded narrative. It didn't need a world-ending conspiracy or a mystical prophecy. All it needed was to focus on Quynh, her return, her rage, and her grief. Imagine a version of The Old Guard 2 where Quynh is the sole antagonist, her mind fractured by 500 years of drowning. Imagine Andy, consumed by guilt, trying to reach the woman she once loved, now unrecognizable in her fury. Imagine Nile, who has been haunted by the nightmares of Quynh, forced to confront the very real and very broken woman behind them. Imagine Joe and Nicky, torn between their loyalty to Andy and their own history with Quynh, which they did have. Imagine Booker, the team's resident self-destructive mess, seeing his own despair reflected in her. Instead, we got a rushed reconciliation because Quynh switched from vengeance to forgiveness happens in seconds. A new pointless new villain, Discord, who adds nothing but a paycheck for Thurman, and a walking Wikipedia page, Tuah, whose only function is to dump exposition.
I got my expiration date.
What made The Old Guard so special wasn't even its action sequences or immortality premise. It was how every frame brimmed with character. That 30-second helicopter shot when no one spoke, it was perfect. The way they all slept on the train, each pose revealing something about who they were, it was brilliant. Even during major plot moments, we were still learning about these people through their reactions, through their silences, their stolen glances. Every character felt present, alive, even when they were not the focus. The Old Guard 2 forgets this entirely. Scenes that should crackle with personality instead play like exposition dumps, with one character monologuing while the others stand around like background decor. At times it feels like you could replace half the cast with cardboard cutouts and lose nothing. Nile, the heart of the first film, is particularly gutted. It seems like she vanishes for huge chunks of runtime, and her groundbreaking discovery that she can end immortality is reduced to a single reaction shot before the movie races to the next plot point. This isn't just bad storytelling, it's betrayal of what made these characters resonate. The result? A film that feels less like a story and more like a placeholder content for a third installment that may never come.
Andy, I've never seen you like this.
Andy's journey in the first film culminated in perfect dramatic irony. After 6,000 years of invincibility, she finally finds her will to fight again, just as her immortality fades. This was storytelling gold, A warrior who'd spent centuries treating her body as an indestructible weapon suddenly has to learn caution, vulnerability, and real stakes. And the sequel squanders this, of course, where we should have seen Andy fighting smarter, using cover, letting her mortal teammates take point, actually feeling fear for her life. We instead get business as usual. Her mortality is mentioned in dialogue but never visualized in action. The opening sequence pairs her with Copley, the only other mortal, instead of strategically using her immortal teammates as shields, a baffling choice that undercuts the entire premise. Worse, the film backtracks entirely by restoring her immortality. It's a cop-out, plain and simple. The writers were too timid to explore what made her ending in the Old Guard so compelling. This should have been Quynn's movie. After 500 years of drowning, her return promised emotional fallout, a chance to explore how trauma reshapes love, how rage corrodes loyalty. Quynh should have been the sequel's beating heart, a walking embodiment of the costs of immortality. Instead, we get whiplash. She is introduced as a force of nature, only to be abruptly tamed with minimal effort. The wasted opportunities here sting. Her obvious romantic history with Andy is sanitized into vague subtext. Netflix almost haze codes them, and her century of torture are resolved through a few conversations. There is a far better version of the story where Quynh is the main antagonist, with her desperation to end her immortality mirroring Booker's suicidal despair. Imagine her threatening Nile's mortal family, for example, to force Nile into granting her death because she's convinced Nile stole Andy's immortality. Just an idea. Instead, she's just another cog in a bloated, lore-choked plot. Nile's demotion from co-lead to plot device is another one of the sequel's sins. The first film positioned her as our entry point, the audience surrogate grappling with her new reality. In the sequel, she's reduced to a MacGuffin, the last immortal who gets no actual arc to explore what that means. Nile should have been torn between two worlds, the mortal family she left behind and the immortal one that she's chosen. She should have been terrified of accidentally hurting her new family. She should have mattered to the story and to us. These three arcs should have intertwined like strands of DNA, because they are in this franchise. Andy, mortal and vulnerable, learning to lead differently. Quynh, furious and broken, forcing everyone to confront immortality's toll. And Nile, caught between her newfound power, making her both savior and threat. Instead, we got a film that forgot to develop its main characters. The tragedy isn't that these characters were underserved, it's that their potential was so clearly visible, shining through the mess, but it never reached us. If there's one thing that the Old Guard 2 gets right about Joe and Nicky, it's that their fundamental characterizations remain intact. Passionate Joe acts first and thinks later. His impulsive decision to contact Booker behind Nicky's back is perfectly in keeping with his nature. Meanwhile, reserved Nicky simmers quietly before his anger surfaces, a contrast that made their dynamic in the first film so compelling. These are still the same men we fell in love with, deeply devoted, flawed in ways that complement each other, and unmistakably them. But here's the problem. Knowing who they are is not the same as exploring who they are. Their conflict, Joe's betrayal, and Nicky's hurt is introduced early and then promptly shelved for most of the movie, only to be resolved off-screen with little fanfare. We don't see the tension between them. We don't witness the moment they choose to bridge this gap. And we certainly don't get the emotional payoff their reconciliation deserved. As if the filmmakers remembered halfway through that they'd set up a rift and hastily glued it back together before the finale. The criticism that the sequel made them less gay is more complicated. Yes, the lack of a kiss is disappointing, especially after the first film's unapologetic intimacy, but their relationship still shines in quieter moments. The teasing during the car chase, the bickering over dinner, the wordless forehead touch that speaks volumes. These are the gestures of a couple who've loved each other for centuries. And the issue isn't that they feel less in love, it's that they feel less central. Which brings us to the film's most baffling oversight, Quynh. Joe and Nicky aren't just Andy's teammates, they are her family. And by extension, they share centuries of history with Quynh. Her return should have been earth-shattering for them too. So where is Nicky's guilt over failing her? Where's Joe's conflicted loyalty between the women they once fought beside and the leader that they follow now? Their silence isn't just an omission, it's a betrayal of the found family that the franchise claims to champion. In the end, Joe and Nicky aren't poorly written, they are underwritten. They are kept on the periphery, their love story reduced to background noise, while the film chases lore and setup. They deserved more than this, and we deserved more than this. What hurts most about Booker's arc in The Old Guard 2 isn't just that it's bad, it's that it had all the ingredients to be devastatingly good, and the filmmakers wasted every single one. At the end of the first film, Booker, broken by centuries of grief and fresh from betraying his family, is sentenced to 100 years alone. That's already fascinating dramatic territory. When we meet him again in the sequel, he's a man stewing in his despair who's willing to give up his immortality in search for meaning. And instead of exploring this, the film takes the cheapest possible exit. Booker's death isn't just unearned, it's actively nonsensical. He manipulates Nile's powers without her consent, a violation the film never addresses, then stages a suicide by cop where Andy could easily have helped him fight. This isn't sacrifice, it's self-destruction dressed up as heroism. With minimal changes, this could have worked. Imagine if Booker had spent the film actually grappling with his demons, forming a bond with Quynh over their shared despair. Imagine if his final act was truly necessary, not a cop-out, but a genuine no-other-way moment. Imagine if he'd sought forgiveness from the team, or at least given Nile agency in her role in his death. That would have been poignant. What we got is just lazy. The real insult, the film seems to think it's being profound. It's not. Having a suicidal character commit suicide is in depth. It's the narrative equivalent of shrugging and saying, well, he wanted to die anyway. So Booker also deserved better. And no, I am not accepting this as canon. In my head, Booker's still out there somewhere, actually dealing with his shit like an adult.
She's telling the truth.
Copley's role in the first film was deceptively brilliant. He served as the team's bridge to the modern world, the mortal man whose research into their history gave them new perspective. His betrayal and subsequent redemption created a compelling dynamic. Here was someone who truly understood all of them, flaws and all, precisely because he wasn't one of them. The sequel reduces him to set dressing. By introducing Tuah, who essentially replicates Copley's function, but with immortality as a bonus, the film renders Copley's entire arc meaningless. Suddenly, his hard-won knowledge isn't special. His unique position as their mortal ally is irrelevant. Even worse, it retroactively cheapens the moment of realization in the first film, where he helped Andy see the cumulative impact of their centuries of work. Now we're supposed to believe Andy had an immortal historian friend all along who'd already shown her this. It doesn't just sideline Copley, it breaks continuity for no payoff.
I was there, you know. I can still remember it.
The saying goes that a story is only as strong as its villain. which explains why the Old Guard 2 lands with such a dull thud. Where Quynh offered a deeply personal antagonist, someone whose pain mirrored the team's own traumas, Discord is generic evil in a pantsuit. Her motivations are paper thin and her presence is entirely unnecessary. As a side, her claim to have witnessed the crucifixion made me chuckle, as Spike from Buffy would say,
"If every vampire who said he was at the crucifixion was actually there, it would have been like Woodstock."
The real tragedy is how transparently she exists to justify Uma Thurman's paycheck rather than serve the story. Every moment spent on her cartoonish villainy is stolen from Quynh's far more compelling rage. She's not a character, she's just a studio note made flesh. Tuah represents one of the most fundamental failures of sequel storytelling, the introduction of a character whose sole purpose is to explain things that didn't need to be explained. Where the first film trusted its audience to sit with ambiguity, Tuah exists as a crutch, a walking talking Wikipedia page dumped into the narrative to deliver clumsy exposition that could have been revealed organically. The team could have uncovered these legends through their own research or investigations. Copley, already established as their researcher, could have pieced together the clues. Instead, we get Tuah, a narrative shortcut that comes at catastrophic cost to the story's internal logic. His presence doesn't just feel artificial, it actively damages the franchise's core principles. The original film's found family dynamic gets gut-punched by the revelation that Andy has been keeping an entire immortal companion secret for who knows how long. This isn't an intriguing mystery, it's a character betrayal that the film expects us to accept without question. And even worse, it violates the established rules of immortality. If these warriors are psychically connected through shared dreams, how has no one ever dreamed of Tuah before? And if they have, why has no one asked Andy about him? And the most egregious failure, however, is Tuah's silence about Nile's supposed power. The film positions him as both an expert on immortal lore and someone who supposedly cares about this family, yet he never once warns Nile that she could accidentally strip her teammates of their immortality. This isn't just bad writing, it's an ethical black hole. Any decent person would immediately alert Nile to this danger to prevent unimaginable tragedy. Tuah's silence doesn't make him mysterious, it makes him either unforgivably negligent or secretly malicious, neither of which the story acknowledges. So in trying to expand the mythology, Tuah instead exposes its weakest seams, a cautionary tale about how sequels often mistakes explanation for depth and lore for storytelling. The Old Guard never needed an immortal historian. Obviously, it needed to trust the history its characters had already lived. And let's talk about the aesthetic tragedy that is The Old Guard 2, because holy hell, the difference between this and the first movie is stark. The first Old Guard wasn't a cinematic revelation, but it was a competent film. But this one, first let's address the elephant in the room. Why does Charlize Theron's face look like it's been smoothed by an overzealous beauty YouTuber? But the real crime here, those god-awful shaky zooms that belong in a workplace comedy, not an epic action drama. Nicky and Joe are having their big emotional confrontation, and suddenly the camera starts doing this janky zoom like we're in the office. The sequel's cinematography is all over the place. And don't even get me started on action scenes. Remember how in the first movie every fight told a story? Here we just get endless messy brawls where you can barely tell who's hitting who. It's like they forgot how to frame action clearly and decided that more shaky cam means more intense, and it's not. And even the color grading is off. Daytime scenes look flat as a pancake, night scenes lose all their moody atmosphere, and everything has this weird plastic sheen. I know it's a Netflix movie and the bar is in hell, but come on. The Old Guard 2 doesn't just fail its predecessor, it fails basic filmmaking one-on-one, and that's not even getting into the writing issues we've just talked about. The Old Guard 2 is a casualty of post-Marvel franchise brain rot, a film that thinks it needs big lore, world-ending stakes, and setup for sequels instead of character-driven storytelling. The Old Guard 2 had everything it needed to be great, and it still failed. But here's the thing, the sequel didn't ruin the first movie for me, not really, because at the end of the day, we'll always have Paris, or in this case, the first perfect movie. The one that made me believe in immortal found families, the one that I can always return to. And I'll drag the good parts of this sequel into the light and let the rest sink. So here's hoping, if we ever get to part 3, that Netflix learns from these mistakes. But given its track record, I'm not holding my breath. Just like Quynh. Too soon, yeah. So what did you think of The Old Guard 2? Did it break your heart, or are you clinging to the good bits? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives.